Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to another video on ForgottenWeapons.com. I'm Ian McCollum and I'm here today at InterOrdnance taking a look at an Ethiopian FN contract Mauser rifle and carbine. And these are one of the really cool pre-World War II contracts that FN got for its small arms. So first off, a little bit of background on FN. They were of course put together as a conglomerate to manufacture rifles for the Belgian military in the late 1880s. After World War I, well, during World War I, they got all of their machinery basically confiscated by the Germans who occupied Belgium and occupied Liège, where FN was located. And so FN kind of spent the first couple years after World War I recuperating, putting its tooling back together. It'd been a while since they manufactured Mausers. There was a lot of new technology coming out. So the original Belgian Mausers had been very early pattern, Mauser model of 1889, with single stack magazines. And well, by the early 1920s, new things have developed. We have the Model 98. Of course, Mauser was manufacturing much upgraded versions throughout the years before World War I. And if FN wanted to compete on the world market, they had to match that. So it took them a couple years to do it. By 1922, they had a rifle. And in 1924, they got their first major contract. And that was the Kingdom of the Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, which a few years later would be renamed Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia, well, the kingdom, ordered something like 100,000 Mauser rifles from FN, also contracted with them to help build their own domestic rifle factory, which would operate for decades. And this really put FN back into business, and it gave them all the expenses that they needed to really set up tooling for these new patterns of rifles. So that takes us to Ethiopia. Now, Ethiopia has this impressive history of being pretty much the only, I probably shouldn't say the only, but virtually, if not the only major African country to avoid becoming a subservient colony of one of the European powers during the late 1800s through early 1900s. At this time, it was being ruled by an emperor by the name of Haile Selassie. He was coronated in 1930, although he'd actually kind of basically run the country as regent since 1917. And he maintained Ethiopia's militarily based independence. So the Italians and the British both had greedy eyes on Ethiopia. Ethiopia holds a relatively strategically important position just off the Red Sea. It's nearby the Suez Canal. It's actually the headwaters of the Nile River and the Nile Valley. And Italy, in particular, had wanted it as a colony for a long time. In fact, the Ethiopians had beaten back a substantial Italian invasion in the 1890s, very impressively. At any rate, by 1930, when Selassie took power, Ethiopia was planning to spend between 12 and 16% of its GDP on arms, on military support. And this kind of split their support in Europe, their diplomatic relations. The British and the Italians were not happy with this. They wanted a weakened Ethiopia that they could take over, and they were always fighting each other over who would get to take it over. The French and the Belgians, however, were much more supportive of Ethiopia, largely because they didn't look at it specifically for their own colonial empires, and they liked the idea of it maintaining independence to prevent it from falling into the hands of their rivals in Europe. So when Selassie was coronated emperor, he took some time and traveled around Europe, met a bunch of people, visited a lot of places, and FN was one of them, and he developed a good working relationship with FN. Between 1933 and 1936, he would buy a significant amount of arms for a smaller, not particularly wealthy African country, and those included 17,500 of these rifles and 7,500 of these carbines, as well as FN BARs and some other equipment. So, in fact, he even had Belgian military advisors come down to help train the Ethiopian army. He had some Swiss advisors as well. They set up military academies. This really was one of the better organized government structures in Africa at the time. So let's take a closer look at these rifles because they're extremely rare and you almost never see them here in the US. We have a rifle and a carbine to take a look at here. I'm going to go ahead and start with the carbine because, well, it's shorter and it's easier for me to show you. As far as mechanical variations go, there's really not that much that distinguishes the Ethiopian guns from FN's other 1924 and 1930 type Mauser rifles and carbines. However, a few little distinctions. On the carbines, there are no side sling swivels, either on the front band or back on the buttstock. That was a fairly common thing at the time. You'll see sling swivels either in the side of the stock or in the side of the grip area, and that was intended for guys who wanted to carry the rifle flat across the back instead of over the shoulder. And for whatever reason, Selassie wasn't interested in that specific capacity. For one, I think it's a good thing, because for me as a left-hander, that side sling swivel on the stock always gets in the way. I do want to briefly point out the sling arrangement here. This thing of having the sling tied up into the stock is an interesting, distinctively Ethiopian thing that I've seen on a number of these rifles that I was looking through. This is an original Ethiopian pattern sling, a little worse for the wear, but neat to see it still there. The markings are really the coolest part here. So starting with the most boring, we have FN's manufacturer mark here on the receiver wall. Manufacture National des Armes de Guerre, Herstal Belgique. Now on most military Mausers, you would expect a serial number right here. Well, instead, we have a Lion of Judah military property mark there. And the serial number is actually written in big old letters here on the back on the receiver bridge. And this was done so that the serial numbers could be easily read when the rifles were stacked in storage racks, which is actually a really practical thing, and it's a little surprising that more countries didn't do that. So it's a little hard to read there, but the bolts were originally matched to the rifles, so 3766 again. The rest of the parts, like the floor plates and trigger guards, are not serialized, so really the only numbers to look for to match are the bolt and the receiver. We then have this really pretty darn cool national crest here on the top of the receiver. So we've got laurels, we've got, I don't even know what that is, a shield, some Amharic writing there, and then the face of the Lion of Judah. So we have that lion here on the side as well. And you'll see this mark on a lot of Ethiopian arms from this era. In fact, if you go back and look at my video on the KE-7 light machine gun, you'll find that it has that marking as well, because it was an Ethiopian contract gun. The rifles have the same crest. I should point out that the receivers for both the rifles and carbines were originally provided or manufactured in the white. These have had a long and hard service life in Ethiopia and beyond. We have the same style of serial number on the back of the receiver bridge and duplicated on the bolt. As is relatively typical for this sort of thing, the carbines had bent bolts and the rifles had straight bolts. The last set of markings we have are proof marks on the right side of the receiver, and these are worth taking a look at for a moment because they sometimes confuse people. These are Belgian proof marks, sort of, but they're not commercial proof marks. This did not go through the standard Liège proof house. Now, the process was normally, if you placed a big order at FN, you would send a military delegation to do the acceptance work, to confirm whether rifles were up to your standards. Well, Ethiopia and some other countries that FN was selling to simply didn't have the domestic technical expertise to do that. They didn't have a group of officers they could send to perform this. So instead, they were able to hire the Belgian military to do so on their behalf. FN is a private company. It is closely associated with the Belgian military, but FN is not a government-run arsenal. And so the Belgian military had a good enough reputation, scrupulously maintained, that you could hire their officers to proof rifles for you. And while the Belgian military arsenals were not legally allowed to produce guns for foreign powers, Belgian officers could be hired to proof guns and approve guns and accept them from private manufacturers like FN on behalf of other nations. So you'll see we have an A with a star, which is a pretty typical Belgian proof mark, and we have a couple other proof marks here that are indicative of the Belgian Foreign Inspection Service, which is what it was called. And Ethiopia was not the only client of FN's to use that Foreign Inspection Service, but they were one of them. So there are some people who see those Belgian proof marks and assume that, well, maybe these guns got manufactured but then diverted to the Belgian military for World War II. It's not the case. So the rest of the features of these guns are pretty standard Mauser. These were all manufactured in 8x57mm or 8mm Mauser. That was the standard cartridge used by the Ethiopian military at the time. No grooves for front sight protector hoods, bayonet lugs. These are cut for cleaning rods, although these two don't have them. And that pretty much is a good overview, I think, of the Ethiopian Mausers. Unfortunately for Ethiopia and Emperor Haile Selassie, in 1935, the Italians under Mussolini got a little more serious about wanting to expand or rebuild their colonial empire, starting with Ethiopia, or, by the way, I should have mentioned this earlier, as it was often referred to at the time, Abyssinia. So in 1935, the Italian army invaded, and Ethiopia may have had a particularly strong military for its time and place, but it was not able to compete with the Italians, especially the Italian Air Force, armored vehicle support. And the Italians ended up capturing the country and occupying it until 1941, when, well, as part of World War II, the British liberated Ethiopia. So, small arms aside, these were good modern arms for the early 1930s, but they weren't enough to hold back a full-scale Ethiopian or Italian invasion. So Selassie would spend a couple of years in exile, and he would come back to his country after World War II, or during World War II, and actually stay in power until 1974. So not what we typically think of Africa as having, these dictators that kind of come and go quickly. Well, Selassie was a very long-lived emperor of the country. Anyway, we'll get into some of what happened after World War II in a separate video when we talk about some of the arms that Ethiopia had later on. For now, these are very, very cool. I'd like to give a big thanks to InterOrdnance for giving me the chance to pull these out and take a look at them. What they have done is actually import a substantial number of very interesting firearms of all types out of Africa, including some of these Ethiopian ones. So if you're interested in seeing more, they're going to be selling the cream of the crop, I think, directly through InterOrdnance. So I can't put a link to their website in the comments because of YouTube's rules, but if you check out InterOrdnance website, you can find all sorts of good stuff. Thanks for watching.